This morning's sermon was written and originally presented by Welsbacher. She's a prolific playwright and author and is currently a fixture at the First UU Church of Wichita, Kansas. In fact, she regularly shares other people's sermons with that congregation, just like I do with you. So I'm delighted to sort of return the favor. And this is called the Tao of IPod. Gadgets, the downfall of a free society, electric litter paving an inexorable path to our culture's moral, intellectual, spiritual, and inevitable destruction. If you are an American living in the 21st century, you likely have fretted over this topic or some variation on it. You might have even done more than just fret. You've read stories online, you've emailed, you've podcasted, you've text messaged, you've Twittered, you've Googled, or you pontificated on your cell phone about it, possibly while driving somewhere that you found with the help of Waze. Oh, you worry. Your kids can't do their homework without at least 2 electronic doodads playing simultaneously. Friends who used to talk to you in person, they're now mass emailing you with slightly off-colored jokes. God knows what sort of cancerous rays are toasting your brain cells every day. Now, this isn't at the top of the list of any sensibly paranoid 21st century American. Far too many other more horrific dangers beckon us daily, from human warfare to the poisoning of our planet's great life-giving gifts, or to snuffing out of our collective thinking skills that the modern cults passing themselves off as media inflict upon us. But it's there, lurking below the surface, this vague worry that all these toys can't possibly be good for us. They're diluting art. They're reducing it to snappy tunes and pyrotechnic tricks. They're stealing away our reading time. They're replacing it with the popcorn of TV commercials. They're sucking us into the capitalist evils of American excess and damning us to live out our golden days that will be consumed with the work of disposing of all the junk we've accumulated and that now corrodes in our basements. But wait. It occurred to me, while jogging along the wildflower-strewn bed of once what-supported railroad tracks laid down for a form of transport nobody uses anymore, it occurred to me I've heard all this before. I grew up in a 1970s academic household, and I remember parties at which people stood around imbibing white wine and martinis, ruining the ruination of our society's culture. A popular refrain of the day was, theater is life, film is art, television is furniture. I distinctly remember my father, who, if you press him on it, he'll acknowledge that he has a PhD, but who, in general, has little tolerance for anything even mildly effluent of pretension, saying to me that when somebody furrowed an eyebrow at him and threw that television is furniture bit at him, he liked to smile sweetly and reply, "Oh, I'll watch any old crap." Except he didn't use the word crap. He said this usually shut him up, so he could go back to watching Bullwinkle or Hee Haw or the WSU football game with a clear head. I like listening to my iPod when I jog. I set it on shuffle, just like I do. An entire lifetime of music, currently 35,000 songs here. And it takes me places I didn't expect to go. Sometimes places I don't particularly want to go. I know that songs were programmed into its soulless metal-encased trappings of zeros and ones, so this hapless little machine isn't really some deranged HAL 9000 taking control of my brain. But I swear sometimes the iPod has its moods. Out of a selection of more than 1,000 songs on hers, It will decide to play 4 Warren Zevon songs in a row. Or it will devise a peculiar time warp around the Beatles, wrapping something from Paul McCartney's Wings around a song by John and Yoko and the Plastic Ono Band, closing the set with George Harrison singing about all those years ago. How and why did it skip the group itself? The reason these soloists even had their own songs. And isn't it lovely that Ringo hasn't changed a whit after all these years? And why is that? Is it that lacking the vapid beauty that thrust the other 3 into the limelight, he was able to lead a more relatively normal life and escape the murderous consequences of the rocker lifestyle? Or did his mediocrity as a musician have something to do with it? And, okay, now wait a minute. I know I'm just reading this, but come on. Anyone who has watched Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary knows with absolute certainty Ringo is one hell of a drummer. Okay? And, she continues, what's the meaning of mediocre anyway? Aren't all measures of success or beauty completely subjective? Which, okay, proves her point. Likewise, there are days when I really don't want to hear Annie DeFranco spew invective at society or former lovers. What I want is the good, wholesome kick of a Kinks song, or the quick wit of Bach. But here instead, here's Annie DeFranco spitting away in some nonlinear fashion, completely at odds with my feet, and since I'm busy trying not to get hit by an oncoming SUV, I can't look for the forward part of the wheel to skip over her. So what happens is, her words disappear. And I notice for the first time that she's done something canny musically, right there in that measure. Slid in something I think might be hip-hop. Forced me to listen to something I have always despised. And so then, I'm thinking about the mathematics of music and how I would never have expected that dissonance to work the way it did. And then suddenly, I'm back at my own front steps, my ode to my blood pressure and endorphin needs finished for the day. So in the past hour, I have pondered art with a capital A, aging, failure, success, beauty, mediocrity, death, topics it would never have occurred to me to think about had I not stuck that piece of cord in my ear. I remember younger days when I ran along the Mississippi, headphone-free. I noted the leaves decaying in the muddy banks of the river. I saw sunlight dappled by half-naked branches of birch trees. I contemplated words I had memorized from wisdom traditions, and even now when I recall them, they boomerang me back to particular bridges and bends in the river that guided me back home. I treasure those memories, and I am glad I had my holy moments, one-on-one with the planet around me. But just as I love red and green, company and solitude, classical and bluegrass, I am glad for the unpredictable insights that I have found with both silence and my iPod. Certainly there are lessons to be taken from the past about the damning potential of gadgets. In a New York Times article, Charles Morris wrote, quote, "The 1870s saw possibly the fastest sustained growth in American history. With the rapid spread of the railroads and the telegraph, new department stores and mail order catalogs, they pressured local producers with mass-produced goods, a precursor to the Walmart era. The productivity shock was comparable to that from the internet in our own day." Unquote. David Tierney writes about the same era in another Times article. He says, "As people abandoned farms and small towns, they lost communal bonds. As personal incomes rose, public air and water got dirtier. Indoor plumbing and washing machines freed women of onerous work, but there was less socializing at wells. A technology reporter for a medical website noted an array of health hazards littering the short distance between you and your electronic toys. Working at night in front of a lit monitor can screw up your internal clock. Other potential hazards are repetitive stress injuries, obesity, permanent hearing loss, accidents from uses of gadgets while driving, even asthma, which might be triggered by some models of laser printers shooting out invisible particles that can lodge deep in the lungs. But most of the negatives about technology and new inventions don't live in isolation. As Tierney notes, although new technology is often described as a Faustian bargain, historically, it has involved a trade-off not between materialism and spirituality, but between individual freedom and social virtue. He goes on, technology's victims have become familiar images in the media. Online addicts who don't know their next-door neighbors. Workers displaced by machines. Frazzled parents, especially working mothers, too busy to spend time with their children. We contrast these pathetic figures with images of a happier past, when people still had time to read, contemplate the meaning of life, visit with their neighbors and friends and relatives. But when exactly, he continues, were those halcyon days? Before the Industrial Revolution, the average person was short-lived and illiterate. Women's lives were consumed with domestic chores and continual pregnancies. Even after the Industrial Revolution, people still didn't have much time to sit around discussing the classics or communing with nature. In the middle of the 19th century, the typical man in Britain, he worked more than 60 hours a week with no annual vacation from age 10 until he died at about 50. Contrary to popular stereotype, he continues, the work week has been shortening, and parents are spending as much time with their children as they did in the 1960s. These children are less likely to live with two parents, which may partly be a consequence of technology that has made divorce and single parenthood less of an economic burden. Men and women today often can both support themselves, relying on machines to make clothes, clean house, and do most food preparation. But new technology is hardly the only cause of the traditional family's decline. And in any case, it's hard to get too nostalgic for the days when women had no choice but to stay in the kitchen. Technology's potentials reach beyond domestic aid, significant as this is. In his book, The Audacity of Hope, Barack Obama, whose status as president existed at least in part because of the electronic devices of this century, describes a tour he took in the nascent days of the Google offices. He writes, a three-dimensional image of the Earth rotated on a large flat panel monitor. These lights represent all the searches going on right now, an engineer told me. Each color is a different language. You can see traffic patterns of the entire internet system. The image was mesmerizing, more organic than mechanical, as if I were glimpsing early stages of some accelerating evolutionary process in which all boundaries, nationality, race, religion, wealth, were rendered invisible and irrelevant, so that the physicist in Cambridge, the bond trader in Tokyo, the student in the remote Indian village, and the manager of a Mexico City department store were all drawn into a single, constant, thrumming conversation, time and space giving way to a world spun entirely out of light. Unquote. Obama's account is a striking illustration, I think, of the hopeful possibilities of a world sewn together in communication and industry. One example of the positive potential of modern electronic gadgets. But he continues. Then I noticed the broad swaths of darkness as the globe spun on its axis. Most of Africa, chunks of South Asia, even some portions of the United States, where the thick cords of light dissolved into a few discrete strands. Technological devices might offer all people a means to lift themselves up, but more importantly, I think devices can show us, more graphically than even good oratory can, where our hard work remains in achieving true parity. When you think about it, the alleged evils of new contraptions, or at least our fears of the dubious evils, they began plaguing us long ago. Talkies were supposed to end the spell of live theater, but they got their comeuppance since today the movie industry regularly bemoans its own exaggerated demise in the face of streaming media. Radio, that heralded pastime of yore, it ushered in the modern era of propaganda as a political tool. Cameras killed portraiture, but today they're major players in museums and the creation of fine art. Further back, actors, they once thrived as traveling journalists, going from village to village to deliver the news orally. When printed pages containing the news, the precursors to tabloid newspapers, themselves now in danger of extinction, when printed pages came into being, they put a whole slew of actors out of business. But anyone notice a shortage of thespians today? Further, Gutenberg's press, besides putting all those monks out of business, also made obsolete the concept of mnemonic devices, which might have weakened our ability as a species to memorize. Probably more significantly, I'm just thinking about this, who knows people's phone numbers now? You don't. You push the button. It's there. Probably more significantly, the Gutenberg press, because it made possible mass printing, diluted the power of the church by spreading literacy beyond its high, narrow, isolated walls. You can go even earlier if you want to. According to some historians, many Greeks absolutely detested the construction of that new mall, the Acropolis, and the invention that has really gotten us into trouble over the years, fire. David Tierney even suggests in his article that the human brain itself was perhaps our earliest new gadget. The original information revolution, he says, occurred during the Pleistocene, a decentralized era, if there ever was one, when hunter-gatherers on the African savanna developed a powerful new computer, the human brain. It evolved into its large size because its information processing capacity enabled humans to band together and increase their chances of survival. Now, we tend to think of computer-like gadgets as the purvey of the young. There's the joke that centers around the idea of the computer so easy to use that a 10-year-old could manage it, but the elder's stymied because he doesn't have a 10-year-old in the house. That would have been one of those cartoons, wouldn't it? But in my life, and I'm guessing I'm not alone here, my parents discovered and embraced many gadgets long before I did. CT scanners, for instance, MRI machines, chemotherapy IV monitors, cunningly designed needles that inject anticoagulants so easily that even a 53-year-old can do it. For those of us circling ever closer to that generally shared human goal of getting old, I offer a purely pragmatic reason to try to embrace the kids' new gadgets. They're here. They're not going anywhere soon. And the kids, at least some of them, seem to understand that they can be used in positive ways. I was in an e-newsletter class recently, and a younger classmate there challenged my tired old definition of a nerd. That cliched, pasty-skinned adolescent boy chained to his computer monitor, capable of speaking only through a screen or an ear device, going days without human contact, much less having any real social skills. Well, apparently, as she patiently informed me, There are actually human chat groups where people who have met online get together in person. And they don't talk about devices or their favorite websites. They talk about life. They talk about love. Saturday's plans, the stuff of eternity. And they never would have met if they hadn't shared some esoteric, hyphenated, abbreviated, acrominated passion like Facebook or Instagram or podcasts or Twitter. Sorry, X. What gadgets like iPods have to offer us in the end is, like so much else in the world we inhabit, an entirely subjective matter based not on what they are, but on who we are. Whether you're jogging, you're running a family, you're experiencing the companionship and loss of loved ones, or seeking your own spiritual path through life, the gadgets we create along the way, they're not either evil destroyers nor enlightened saviors. In the final analysis, what matters isn't the tools you use, but how you as a person choose to embrace, ignore, interpret, or flourish using them. And Welsbacher.